Well, hello. The screen reminds you to get tea. Well, that's cool. I'll be talking for like 10 minutes as per usual. So yeah, feel free to run off and go and get tea. That is an excellent plan. Let me just check. Oh, the heating is coming on. Good. I am freezing cold this evening. But first, the introductions. Hello, I'm Sam, and you are listening to Chilliteracy, where tonight I'm going to be reading a short story by Mary Elizabeth Braddon called Colonel Benyon's Entanglement. And we'll get to that in time. But yeah, first introductions. Well, no, introductions done. Now chat. Hello, yeah. Yeah, Ray Tracer, go and get tea. I'm freezing cold this evening. It is sure weathery outside here at the moment. There is wind and rain in competing amounts, each trying to one up the other going on outside. So while the rain sound you hear through the mic is probably all just the stuff that we've piped in on a loop. You may get some of the authentic diegetic stuff too, which thank you, Rain, for that little drum roll on the window. Hope you don't get that tomorrow. I don't know which way it's going, Arian. But maybe if you don't want it, then I hope that you don't get it. That's good enough for me. But yeah, I'm sat here like tucked up under a blanket because it was suggested the other day that I could just have a blanket on me, and actually that'll probably keep me a little bit warmer because my room gets cold sometimes. But updates, the heating is coming on, so maybe that'll be okay. But yeah, hello. How are you? How have you been? How's things? What do I have to talk about if not this book? Not much has really been going on for me. Really, been a bit rough, but slowly improving. Did a stream last night on the main John's channel, which was very nice, and do want to do some more of that because the game was cool and I would like to see it out, and I think people watching would also like to see the end of it. So I don't know when that will be, but hopefully sometime soon. I also keep meaning to go up to Hollow Knight, which would be good because that was good. But yeah, books. Yeah, this one tonight, I guess I'll get onto that, is as I say, it's by Mary Elizabeth why can't I read the names? Mary Elizabeth Braddon, who was from 1835 to 1915. Apparently this was written in 1872. I've read another piece by her, and I forget every time which one, so I'm actually just going to grab the book off the shelf and remind myself. One sec. I've got a feeling it was Man-Sized in Marble, one that we did back in October. Oh no, that was it. Shadow in the Corner. Just a sad tale about some abusive people in our house who had a servant girl who kept saying, hey, there's something horrible going on in the room. I keep having trouble sleeping. They're like, oh, she's just rubbish and lazy and we hate our servant girl. And then she died. So yeah, that was a jolly story. I remember reading that one. But it was good, if sad. Oh yes, that's it. Lucy Lumph isn't around at the moment fully, but will be around when she can. But that's fine. We'll prevail. But yeah, this story is it's from, again, my collection of Cornish horrors, Tales from the Land's End. I've read through it earlier today. Well, some today, some earlier in the week. That's by the by. I wouldn't honestly describe it as much of a horror story from what I got from it. It's more just a tale of mystery, and intrigue and stuff. Bit of a sort of love story, I guess, kind of gets in there. I will address a couple of things. Firstly, the main character, Colonel Benyon, your protagonist, Herbert Benyon, is described as colonel of a Bengal cavalry regiment, and has been spending time in military, well, serving the military in India. So there's obvious themes of colonialism there, which do make me uncomfortable, but it's not really integral to the plot. It's kind of informs his character a little bit that he's in the army, but yeah, it doesn't really give either a pro or anti stance to colonialism. So just to be clear, mine and the views of this channel are that it was bad. It was a very bad thing for us, the English, to do, to lay claim to the rest of the world and go abroad and try to take it for ourselves and to do the things that we did. As I say, I don't think the story particularly makes much of a statement either way, but I just want to make that clear out there that no, we're not down with that. And so yeah, had this been oh, that was great, I'd either skim around it or probably not read the story if it was ingrained through the whole thing. Trying to think what other things I was going to say about this. I was originally going to try and do a bit of a Cornish accent for some of the characters, and then it occurred to me that pretty much all of the characters, bar maybe one or two, are Cornish, and would lead to me having to do pages of text in an accent, which I'm going to struggle to maintain. I know it a bit, but more by ear than something that I can easily recreate. So I can do it for a little bit, but me trying to maintain that for whole paragraphs and pages is just going to sound weird and bad and probably upsetting to the Cornish. I have good reading who listen to the VOD. No worries, Arian. Have yourselves, you just the one of you. Have yourself a good evening. Thank you for being here. And also, yes, thank you for the sub. I was going to say it when I went live. But yeah, thank you for the resub. Very much appreciated. We are extremely grateful. While I'm distracted, I'm going to see what else is said in chat. Ray Tracer, that far game is cool. Would like to see the end of it played a bit. I played a bit with your kid last night and he enjoyed it. Yes, I saw the picture you posted of you with it. That's really cool. It's kind of still surreal to me to be hey, I played a game on a stream, and then people that were watching it have gone and bought that. It's am I an influencer? And to be honest, I hope not, because, yeah, I shouldn't be trusted to influence anyone's opinion. But no, that's really cool. I'm really glad that you've seen something and gone, hey, that's neat, and you're getting into it and playing it with your kid. That's really cool, and I love that. All of you, the collective Aryans, will have a good evening. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. I hope so. But yes, no, I won't be. I originally planned to do a Cornish accent, but I won't probably be doing a Cornish accent because, yeah, it's probably just going to end up offensive. Is this an influencer? Gestures at butterfly. Exactly. What else? This is, yeah, usually when I've been doing these, it's been a bunch of short stories because they've been 5, 10, 15 pages long, and one of those won't comprise a whole stream, so I'll fit in a few. This one is closer to 60 pages, which at the rate I read is roughly good enough for a stream. So I'm rambling a bit now and taking up some time, and yeah, it might mean finishing a little bit early. But yes, my plan is just to read the one story tonight. And yeah, I guess any other stuff I can get into, we can get into in the break halfway or at the end. Yeah, do I have anything else to say? I don't think so. Probably yes, and I'll remember halfway through and then forget again. So if you hear me get distracted in the middle of reading, that's what's happened. I've just clicked over and gone, oh yeah, that other thing I was going to do. But, oh, actually that reminds me, I need to set my laptop to be quiet. Thank you. And give myself a marker so that when I start, I can start. Yeah, I guess if everything is done and out the way, I'll probably start reading. So this is Colonel Benyon's Entanglement by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Part 1. Thou seest we are not all alone unhappy. This wide and universal theatre presents more woeful pageants than the scene wherein we play in. It was late in July when Herbert Benyon, colonel of a Bengal cavalry regiment, landed at Southampton from one of the P&O steamers home from India on sick leave. The colonel had been very ill indeed with jungle fever, very close to the shadowy boundary which divides us from that unknown country, whither we are all journeying with steady footsteps on the separate roads of life. The fresh sea breezes and idle steamboat life had done a good deal for him, but he still bore the traces of that desperate sickness. The sunburnt face was wan and haggard, and there were lines of premature age about the mouth and dark shadows under the large, lustrous grey eyes. Those eyes of Colonel Benyon's had been wont to strike terror to the souls of defaulting soldiers, conscious of a deficiency in the way of pipe-clay or a laxity as to drill. The grey seemed to change to black when the colonel was angry, and at such times his men were apt to say that their commanding officer looked a very devil. He was not exactly a martinet either, and was known to be as particular about the comfort and well-being of his soldiers as he was about their appearance on parade, but he was a hard master, and his men feared him. The colonel gave a sigh. That was the next thing to a groan, as the express from Southampton slackened its pace at Waterloo. He had a first-class carriage all to himself, and had littered all the seats with an accumulation of newspapers, dispatch boxes, dressing bags, and such light luggage. He had tramped to and fro in the narrow space like some restless lion in its den during that rapid journey, had taken up one newspaper after another, and tossed it aside again with an air of weariness nigh unto death. And now, at the end of his journey, during which he had seemed devoured by impatience, he groaned aloud from very heaviness of spirit. I just have to let Joey in 1 second. He was 39 years of age, something over 6 feet in height, broad-shouldered, strong-limbed, and, if not exactly handsome, at least distinguished-looking. His military career had been one continued success, and the men who knew him best prophesied for him distinction in the future. He had been 11 years away from England, and had passed through the fiery furnace of the Indian Mutiny, reaping a harvest of laurels from that most bloody field. And now he came home with 2 years' furlough, a handsome balance at his English bankers, and not a creature in the world with a claim upon his purse or his care. A more thoroughly independent man than Herbert Benyon never landed upon British soil. He had escaped the rocks and shoals of matrimony by what his brother officers called a fluke. In plain words, he had been jilted at the outset of his career by a high-born and penniless flirt, who had thrown him over at the last moment in favour of a wealthier suitor. In all outward seeming he had borne his disappointment gaily enough, but from that hour he had become as man hewn out of granite in relation to all womanly fascinations. The prettiest girls in Calcutta, the most dangerous young matrons in the Indian military world, had flashed their brightest glances upon him with no more effect than the rising sun has nowadays upon the head of Memnon. He was one of the best waltzers in English India, and was wont to declare that waltzing was an intellectual exercise. Thank you, Joey. But in all the giddy mazes of a dozen seasons, Colonel Benyon had never been known to entangle himself. Excuse me. There were women who were said to have been, in the graceful phraseology of the junior officers, down any amount of pit or up no end of a tree, on the subject of the colonel. But the colonel himself had never been known to smile upon a woman with anything warmer than the conventional smile demanded of him by society, since the hour when Lady Julia D'Ursay had written to tell him that she had looked into her own heart, and found that it was better for both of them that they should break an engagement which could never result in happiness to either. He had taken life pleasantly enough withal, and was eminently popular among his brother officers, a great billiard player, a most implacable and inscrutable opponent at the whist table, and a mighty hunter of those larger animals which enliven the jungle by their existence. He had sent home innumerable tiger claws mounted in silver, as labels for his English friends' decanters, and had more skins of wild beasts than he knew what to do with. Indeed, Herbert Benyon excelled at all of those accomplishments which win a man the respect of his fellow men and the admiration of the softer sex. He was rich as well as successful. A bachelor uncle had died during his absence in the East, leaving him a considerable fortune and a fine old place in the north of Scotland. It would have seemed as if a man could scarcely desire more good things than had fallen to the lot of Herbert Benyon, and yet the man was not happy. Coming home to familiar scenes after those 11 years of exile awoke no thrill of rapture in his heart. He had perhaps no enthusiastic affection for the country of his birth. In any case, his return brought him no pleasure, only a gloomy sense of his own isolation. Near relatives he had none. Neither sister nor brother would smile a welcome upon him. His father and mother had been dead 20 years. He had some distant kindred, of course, men and women who bore his name and professed a certain amount of affection for him, and he had friends by the score, the people to whom he had sent tiger claws, and wonderful inlaid boxes lined with sandalwood and cashmere shawls and embroidered muslins, and all those treasures of Ind wherewith the wanderer is wont to gratify his acquaintance. But that was all. Amongst all the men he knew, there was only one to whose friendly smile and welcoming grasp of the hand he looked forward with any ray of real pleasure. This was a man of about his own age, a comrade at Eton and Cambridge, a certain Frederick Hammersley, who had begun life as a country curate and had been spoiled for the church by the inheritance of a comfortable fortune, and the development of views in which his diocesan, a bishop of evangelical tendencies, had recognized a leaning towards Romanism. Mr. Hammersley had not gone over to Rome, however. He had contented himself with writing several theological pamphlets setting forth his principles, which were of the most advanced Anglican school, and with doing much good in his immediate neighbourhood. If he were no longer an accredited shepherd, he had not forgotten the divine precept, "Feed my sheep." The last that Colonel Benyon had heard of this friend was the announcement of his marriage. They did not maintain friendship by an interchange of long letters, like a couple of schoolgirls. Each, in his way, was fully occupied by the business of life, and each felt secure of the other's friendship. There was no need of pen and ink protestations between men of this stamp. Yes, there was some pleasure for the Colonel in the thought of meeting Fred Hammersley. He deposited his goods and chattels at the British in Cockspur Street, and went straight to his friend's club, the respectable Anatheum. The London season was over, and passers-by stared a little at the Colonel's tall figure with its unmistakable military air. There were some changes in the aspect of things even at this end of town, since those days before the Indian Mutiny, but the Colonel did not take the trouble to notice them. The Corinthian pillars of a renovated clubhouse or a new shop front here and there seemed trivial objects to a man fresh from the natural splendours of Kashmir. Or it may be that Herbert Benyon was uninterested in these things for lack of any personal association that went home to his heart. When he came to the Anatheum, where he had eaten many a pleasant dinner with his old friend, the familiar look of the hall stirred something in his breast that was almost emotion. He was doomed to encounter a disappointment here. Mr. Hammersley was abroad, the porter told him, on the continent. The porter could not tell where, but he had been absent for a long time ever since last spring was a 12-month, the porter said, pulling himself up, as if he had been about to say something else. And his letters? Asked the Colonel. What becomes of them? We don't get many, answered the man, but any that do come here for him are sent to Coots. He's always on the move, they say, but nobody but his bankers knows where to find him. There was something in the man's face that impressed Colonel Benyon with the idea that he could say more if he pleased. He lingered on the threshold of the stranger's rooms with a dubious, meditative air and slipped half a sovereign into the porter's hand, almost as if from pure absence of mind. "Thank you, sir. You're very kind, sir. I'm sure I'm sorry enough Mr. Hammersley has left us. It was always a pleasure to do anything for him. Not that he ever gave any trouble. Wanting hansoms fetched when it's raining cats and dogs or anything of that kind. He was always quiet in his ways and affable in his manners. I wish there was more like him. And it do seem a hard thing that he should have to turn his back upon his country like that." The colonel stared at the speaker. "But he travels for his own pleasure, I suppose," he exclaimed. "He had no particular reason for leaving England?" "Well, yes, sir. There was an unpleasant circumstance connected with his going away. Of course, at the West End those things get talked of, and a person in my position can't shut his ears to such reports. I should be the last in the world to talk, but there's nothing going on that don't come to my hearing somehow." Colonel Benyon stared aghast. What did it mean? Had Frederick Hammersley, that most conscientious and devoted of Anglicans, committed forgery? What was the meaning of this enforced exile? Then a light suddenly flashed on in the colonel's mind. "His wife is with him, I suppose?" he said interrogatively. "No, sir. Mrs. Hammersley is not with her husband. In fact, his going abroad arose from circumstances connected with that party. She turned out a bad lot, sir. I should be the last to speak disrespectuously of a lady, and of a lady connected with ourselves, as I may say. But I have heard our gentlemen say that Mrs. Hammersley's conduct was very bad." "She left him, I suppose?" "Yes, sir. Ran away from him after they'd been married a little better than 6 months, with a gentleman they say she was engaged to before she kept company with Mr. Hammersley. The marriage was her father's doing, so I've heard, and when this gentleman, who was a captain in the army, came home from India, she ran away with him. They went to Ostend and such like places together, and 2 months afterwards the captain was found dead early one September morning, shot through the heart on the sands of Blankenberg. There was a great piece of work. Everyone had thought it was a duel and that Mr. Hammersley had killed him, but he was supposed to be in London at the time. No one had seen him or heard of him in Belgium, and they never tried to bring it home to him. The matter dropped after a little while. Mr. Hammersley got a divorce soon after and left England directly the case was decided." "And what became of the lady?" asked the colonel, curious to know the fate of a creature so lost. "I've never heard, sir. She made no defence in the divorce court. It would go rather hard with her, I should think, the captain being dead, unless her friends took her back, which don't seem likely." "Poor wretch. Do you remember the man's name?" "What, the captain, sir? I've heard it, times and often. He was a junior United gentleman. Let me see, was it Chandos? No, Champney, Captain Champney." Colonel Benyon remembered the name, but not the man. He was in a line regiment, altogether an obscure person compared with a dashing colonel of Bengal cavalry. He had not even heard of the scandal connected with the poor fellow's death. He had never been an eager devourer of English newspapers, unless they had some bearing on the politics of martial India, so whatever mention there had been of Champney's death and Hammersley's divorce had escaped him. He left the Anatheum and strolled into his own club, the Senior United Service, very much cast down. He ordered his dinner. It was growing dusk by this time, and the coffee room had an empty and even sepulchral look, with lamps glimmering here and there in the twilight, like the religious gloom of some Egyptian temple. Modern architects have a knack of giving an air of Carthage or Babylon to their public dining rooms. After dinner, the colonel wrote to his old friend an honest, straightforward epistle, touching lightly upon Frederick Hammersley's trouble, but withal full of manly sympathy. Not such a flowery missive as the Orestes of a French novel would have addressed to his Pylades, under the like circumstances, but a thorough English letter. If Hammersley were within any accessible distance, the colonel proposed to join him as soon as he was strong enough for the journey. "I am on leave for my health, and for that alone," he wrote, "and I do not see why I should not get well as fast, or perhaps faster, abroad than I should in England. I have scarcely any association in this country that I care to renew. I am not even eager to visit that stern old Scottish barrack where you and I once hunted the Caledonian boar or stag in an autumnal holiday, and which now belongs to me. In short, I have outlived most of the illusions of life, and have nothing left, save a belief in friendship where you are concerned. Let me come, my dear Hammersley, unless solitude is your fixed humour, but do not say yes if inclination says no. Colonel Benyon addressed this letter to his friend under cover of Mrs. Coutts, and having done this, he felt almost as if he had no more to do until the wanderer's reply came. The waiters at United Service told him that London was empty, in a fashionable sense, a veritable desert. Yet no doubt there were people he knew to be found in the great city, and there were theatres enough open for his amusement, had he cared to visit them. But he had lost his relish for the modern drama 15 years before, so he went home to the British, read the papers, and drank the weakest decoction of soda and brandy until an hour or so after midnight. He had a little business to transact with his army agent next day, and an interview with a stockbroker in Warnford Court, to whom he entrusted the investment of those moneys which had accumulated during his absence. On the day after, he made a round of calls at the houses of his old acquaintances, and had reason to acknowledge the truth of the waiter's assertion as to the barrenness of civilized London. Everyone best worth seeing was away. There were 2 or 3 businessmen who professed themselves the most miserable drudges in the great mill which is always grinding everything into money. Here and there in that obscure region beyond Eaton Square he found a homely matron who lamented her inability to take the dear children to the seaside until Edwin or Augustus should be able to leave that tiresome office in the city, and who seemed unaffectedly rejoiced to see the colonel. But the choicer spirits among his old circle, the Dessus de Panier, were away yachting off Cowes or gambling in Germany. Altogether the day was a dreary one. Colonel Benyon was glad to return to the solitude of his hotel and the intellectual refreshment of the evening papers. After this he idled away a week in revisiting such familiar haunts of his early manhood as he cared to see again. The contemplation of them gave him very little pleasure. That one brief letter of Julia D'Ursay's seemed to have taken all the sunshine out of his nature. There was a settled bitterness in his mind, a sense that outside his profession there was nothing in the world worth living for. Nearly a fortnight went by before there came any answer from Mr. Hammersley, and the colonel felt that he could shape no plan for his holiday till he received his friend's reply. The letter came at last, a letter that went to Herbert Benyon's heart, for it told him in a few words how dire a death blow had shattered his friend's life. "No, my dear Benyon," wrote the exile, whose letter was dated from a small town in Norway, "you must not join me. The day may come, God only knows when, in which I may be fitter for a friend's companionship, but at present I am too miserable a creature to inflict my society upon any one I care for. I have been roughing it in this country for the last 6 months, and like the fishing, the primitive life, and simple friendly people. But I doubt if such an existence in such a climate as this would suit an Anglo-Indian valetudinarian, even supposing I were decent company. I write in all candour, you see, my dear Benyon, and I do not think you will doubt my regard for you, because, under the bitter influence of an affliction which happily few men can measure, I shrink even from your companionship. And now I have a proposition to make to you. You are home on sick leave, you tell me, and really in need of perfect rest. I have a house in the extreme west of Cornwall, a cottage in a garden of roses, within sight of the sea, which I think would suit you to a nicety, if I can persuade you to make your home there for the next few months. The place is full of bitter associations for me, and I doubt if there is another living creature to whom I would offer it, but I shall be heartily glad if you will inhabit a spot that was once very dear to me. The climate is almost equal to Madeira, and if you have any inclination left for that kind of thing, there is plenty of shooting and hunting to be had in the neighbourhood. I have a couple of old servants in charge of the place, to whom I shall write by this post, telling them to hold themselves ready for your reception. So you will have nothing to do but put yourself into the train at Paddington any morning you please, and go straight through to Penjuda, from which station a 7-mile drive will carry you to Trewardle, by which barbarous name my place is known. If you would drop a line to Andrew Johns, Trewardle, near Penjuda, beforehand, to announce your coming, he would meet you at the station with a dog-cart. There are a couple of good hacks in the stable, and a hunter I used to ride 2 years ago, which is, I fancy, about up to your weight. The offer was a tempting one, and after some hesitation the Colonel decided upon accepting it. Cornwall was a new country to him, a remote, semi-barbarous land, he fancied, still pervaded by the Phoenicians and King Arthur, a land that had been more civilized 2,000 years ago than today, a land with which Solomon had had trading relations in the way of metal, a land where, at some unknown period, the children of Israel had worked as slaves in the mines, a land of which one might believe anything and everything, in fact. There was some smack of adventure in the idea of going to take possession of his absent friend's house, some faint flavour of romance in the whole business. It would be dull, of course, but the Colonel liked solitude and found himself year by year less inclined for the kind of life most people consider pleasant. He might have spent his autumn in 6 fine old country houses and received unlimited petting from their fair inhabitants if he had desired that kind of thing, but he did not. He only wanted to recover his old health and vigour and then go back to India. He wrote to Mr. Andrew Johns, informing that worthy of the probable time of his arrival, and 3 days afterwards turned his back upon the great city, and sped away westwards across the fields, where the newly cut stubble was still bright and yellow, onward through a region where the land was red, then away, skirting the edge of the bright blue water, across Isambard Brunel's wonderful bridge at Saltash, and then along a narrow line that flies over deep gorges in the woodland, through a fair and lonely landscape to the little station of Penjuda. It was dusk in the late summer evening when the traveller heard the barbarous name of the place called out with the unfamiliar Cornish accent by a stalwart Cornish porter. The train, which had been about 1/4 of a mile long when it left Paddington, had dwindled to a few carriages, and those were for the most part empty. Penjuda seemed the very end of the world. The perfect quiet of the place almost startled the Colonel as he stood upon the platform, looking round about him in the faint grey evening light. He found himself deep in the heart of a wooded valley with no sign of human life within sight except the 2 officials who made up the staff of Penjuda Station. There was a balmy odour of pines and a subdued rustle of leaves lightly stirred by the warm west wind. Among the Indian hills he could scarcely remember a scene more lonely. A rabbit ran down a wooded bank and scudded across the line while he was looking about him. The guard told him afterwards that scores of these vermin might be seen playing about the line at odd times. The trains were not frequent enough to scare them. Outside the station the Colonel found an elderly manservant out of livery, with a smart dog-cart and a capital horse. This was Andrew Johns. He handed the reins to the traveller and took his seat behind in charge of Colonel Benyon's portmanteaus, and a few minutes afterwards the Colonel was driving up a hilly road that wound across the twilit woods. That 7 miles' drive to Trewardle was all up and down hill. The Colonel had rarely encountered a stiffer road even in the east, but the landscape, dimly seen in that dubious light, seemed to him very beautiful, and he was glad that he had accepted his friend's offer. From the top of one of the hills he caught a glimpse of the distant sea. On the summit of another there was a stretch of common land, and a tall obelisk that served as a beacon for all the countryside, a monumental tribute to a great Indian soldier. Something over half an hour brought them into a valley, where there was a church with a square tower surmounted with stone pinnacles, a church of some pretension for a parish which consisted of about 6 houses. Close to the church were the gates of Trewardle. They stood open to receive the stranger, and, after a winding drive through a shrubbery, the Colonel saw the lighted windows of a long, low, white-walled cottage, half smothered in foliage and flowers. Mrs. Johns and a fat-faced housemaid were waiting in the hall, and a male hanger-on in corduroy and a stable jacket was in attendance to receive the horse. Everything within looked bright and homelike. One might have fancied the house in full occupation. The hall was low and wide, with panelled walls painted white, and hung with watercoloured sketches prettily framed. The dining room was a comfortable square apartment with light oak furniture of the modern medieval order, and dark blue silk hangings. The drawing room opened out of it, and was more of a boudoir or ladies' morning room than an actual drawing room. Everywhere, in the dining room, and even in the entrance hall, there were books, from ponderous folios, choice editions on elephant paper, to the daintiest duodecimos in white vellum binding. There was a brightness and prettiness about everything which the Colonel never remembered to have noticed in any house before. It looked like a home that had been made beautiful by the hands of a lover preparing a bower for his bride. A woman must have been hard to please who could not make herself happy here, and was so good a fellow as Fred Hammersley, he said to himself. An excellent dinner had been prepared for him, at which repast the versatile Mr. Johns waited, and proved himself an admirable butler. The Colonel asked him a good many questions about the neighbourhood in the course of the meal, to all of which Mr. Johns replied with considerable intelligence, but he uttered no word about his absent master, or of the kind of existence that he had led there in the brief period of his wedded life. It was 10 o'clock when Colonel Benyon had finished dinner, a warm moonlit night, so he went out to explore the gardens and enjoy his evening smoke. It might be very long before any feminine presence would lend its grace to those bright-looking rooms, but Herbert Benyon would as soon have thought of committing sacrilege as of desecrating his friend's house with the odour of tobacco. A woman had left the impress of her individuality upon everything. Those watercoloured sketches in the hall were signed by a woman's hand. In the drawing-room there were caskets and writing cases, work baskets and photographic albums, innumerable trifles that were unmistakably a woman's belongings. It seemed as if everything had been religiously preserved exactly as the traitress had left it. Colonel Benyon could fancy her last look round this room, or fancied that he could fancy it. There was a low armchair on one side of the fireplace, with a gem of a work-table beside it, her seat, of course. How often had she sat there meditating treason, with her husband sitting opposite to her, perhaps, watching her fondly all the while, and thanking God for having given him so sweet a wife. "Confound the woman," muttered the Colonel impatiently. "I can't get her out of my mind." It did indeed seem to him tonight as if that false wife had left an evil influence upon the scene of her iniquity. He could not feel at ease in the house. He could not help wondering and speculating about that lost creature. Where is she now? He asked himself, and then there arose before him an image of her sitting alone in some sordid continental lodging, poor, friendless, desolate, or worse, flaunting on a Parisian boulevard in the livery of sin. Do what he would, he could not help thinking of her. "It will wear off in time, I suppose," he said to himself, "but upon my word, if I were her husband, I could scarcely worry myself more about her." He went out into the gardens and roamed about amongst the flower beds, and in the darksome shrubbery paths, smoking and communing with himself for more than an hour. The grounds of Trewardle were spacious and lovely, quite out of proportion with the humble pretensions of the house. There was a lake on one side of the lawn, on the other a group of fine old plane trees. Beyond these a short avenue of elms leading to a meadow that looked almost a park. The soft night air was heavy with the perfume of myrtle and magnolia. "The place is a perfect Eden," said the Colonel, "but I wish I had not been told the history of Eve and the serpent." Let's have some water. Very loudly, sorry. Part 2. Name her not now, sir. She's a deadly theme. For the first fortnight of his sojourn at Trewardle, Colonel Benyon's Cornish experiences were altogether agreeable. The weather was brilliant, and in a county much given to moisture, he was not inconvenienced by a single shower. There was plenty for him to see within a day's ride. Here a ruined castle, there a nobleman's seat renowned amongst the show places of the West, and during those first 2 weeks the colonel spent the greater part of every day in the saddle or on foot, tramping over sunburnt hills high above a broad sweep of sea, while his horse rested at some solitary rustic inn. He was somewhat inclined to forget how short a time had gone by since he was lying in his Indian bungalow, well nigh given over by the regimental doctors. Perhaps in that first fortnight of genuine enjoyment he sowed the seeds of a mischief which was to overtake him by and by. The third week brought him into September, and he had a good time of it among the partridges, with Andrew Johns for his guide and counsellor. For 3 consecutive mornings the 2 men set out at daybreak when the dew was heavy upon the ground, and tramped over miles of stubble and turnip field before breakfast. On the 4th day the colonel suddenly knocked under, and told Mr. Johns that he had had enough just for the present. Partridge shooting was all very well in its way, but there were shooting pains in the colonel's limbs, and a dull, perpetual aching in the colonel's shoulders, which a man of 40 rarely cares to cultivate. There was a drizzling rain, too, upon that 4th day of September, and Colonel Benyon was very glad to find a blazing fire in the bright-looking drawing-room, wherein he had a knack of painting imaginary scenes out of that tragical drama of which Flora Hammersley had been the heroine. In his enforced idleness today, the thought of his friend's sorrow and this woman's sin haunted him more vividly than ever. That young soldier lying dead in the chill autumn sunrise on the sands near Blankenberg, slain by a hand that had never before been lifted to do a cruel thing, the hand of a generous single-minded man. As to the fact of Fred Hammersley's share in this transaction, Colonel Benyon felt no doubt. His friend had killed the seducer. It was a thing he would have done himself, unhesitatingly, under like circumstances. He walked up and down the room. He had read yesterday's Times and Globe, Standard and Telegraph, and there was no more mental pabulum for him till a post came in, per special messenger on pony from the nearest post town, at 5 p.m. At another time Mr. Hammersley's splendid library might have afforded him ample entertainment, but today he was in no humour for books. He had opened half a dozen or so, and after skimming a page or two absently, had put each volume back on its particular shelf. He could not fasten his mind upon any subject. The rain came down in a monotonous, hopeless way. Even the standard roses on the lawn outside had a dreary look. The colonel longed, like Horace Walpole, to bring them indoors and put them by the fire. Sometimes Colonel Benyon stood staring out at the deluged garden. Sometimes he threw himself into a low armchair by the fire and amused himself by a savage demolition of the coals. Anon he paced the room again, pausing now and then in an idle way to examine some of those womanly trifles whose presence reminded him of the lost mistress of Tribordel. The day seemed interminable. He was glad when it grew dark, still more glad of the slight distraction afforded by his 7 dinner, though he had no appetite, an utter distaste for food indeed, and a burning thirst. "I feel very much as I used to feel at the beginning of my fever," he said to himself, a little alarmed by the symptoms, and by the heaviness and aching of his limbs. "God forbid that I should have another spell of it." Andrew Johns had gone to the market town on business connected with the victualling of the small household, and Mrs. Johns had put on a black silk gown and her best cap to wait upon the colonel, not caring to trust that delicate office to the fat-faced rustic handmaiden. "The girls we get hereabouts are so rough," she said, "and this one has never been used to much out of the dairy. We had a house full of servants when Mr. Hammersley lived here, but since he's gone abroad there's been scarcely enough work for me and a girl." The dame gave a profound sigh. Colonel Benyon perceived that she was garrulously given, and perceived that if he had a mind to hear about his friend's history in this house, it would not require any great effort to set Mrs. Johns discoursing thereupon. "Do try one of those red mullets, sir. I dressed them with my own hands. It's a sauce that Mr. Hammersley was fond of. Poor dear gentleman." Here came another profound sigh, and the dame lingered, trifling absently with the arrangements of the sideboard, as if willing to be questioned. "You seem to have been very fond of your master," said the colonel. "We shouldn't be much account if we weren't fond of him," replied Mrs. Johns. "He was as good a master as ever lived. We'd known him from a boy, too. He used to come down to Penrose Abbey for his holidays in the old squire's time. Mr. Penrose, you've heard of him, I dare say, sir. Andrew and me were butler and cook at Penrose for 20 years. Mr. Hammersley was only a distant relation to the squire, you see, sir, and nobody thought that he'd come in for all the property. But he did. I suppose Mr. Penrose took a fancy to him when he was a boy. But there were plenty more young nephews and cousins on the lookout for his money, I can tell you." "Did Mr. Penrose ever live here?" "No, sir. Trewardle was his mother's place, and it was shut up after her death. But since Mr. Hammersley came into the estate, the abbey has been kept as a show house. He didn't care to live there. It was cold and gloomy, he said, and he took a fancy to this place and had it done up against his marriage. The power of money he spent upon it, to be sure. But dear me, sir, you haven't eaten a mouthful of that mullet. Perhaps you don't like the sauce?" "It's excellent, my dear Mrs. Johns, but I really have no appetite this evening. And there's a boiled fowl with stewed artichokes, and a brace of those birds you shot the day before yesterday. I hope you'll eat something, sir." "I'm sorry to do injustice to such good cooking, but upon my word I can't eat a morsel. If you'll make me a stiffish glass of brandy and water, as hot as you can make it, I think perhaps it might do me some good. I had a bad fever in India, and seem to have a touch of my old enemy tonight." "Wouldn't you like Andrew to ride back for the doctor as soon as he comes in? Or I could send one of the men at once, sir." "On no account. Pray don't make an invalid of me. I walked a little too far today after the partridges yesterday. I dare say I've knocked myself up, that's all. Even if I should feel worse, which I don't expect, I've some medicine in my dressing case." Mrs. Johns mixed her brandy and water with an anxious face, and watched the colonel while he drank it. Then she persuaded him to return to the drawing-room, where she ensconced him luxuriously in an easy-chair by the fire, with a tiger-skin carriage rug over his knees. "Don't hurry away, Mrs. Johns," he said, after duly acknowledging her attention. "I like to hear you talk of my poor friend Hammersley. Sit down by the fire, do, there's a good soul. That's right. It looks quite comfortable and homelike to see you sitting there. I could almost fancy I'd discovered some treasure in my way of an aunt. I can't tell you how dreary I've felt all day. My mind has been running perpetually upon poor Hammersley and his wife. It's no use speaking of them to your husband. If I do, he tightened up his lips in the most impenetrable way, and is dumb immediately." "Yes, sir, that's just like Andrew," replied the dame, smoothing her white muslin apron and setting herself comfortably in the chair opposite the colonel's. "I think he'd lie down on the ground for his master to walk over him. But you can never get him to talk about him, nor of her either, poor soul." "She behaved so badly and worked such ruin that I almost wonder you can find it in your heart to pity her," said the colonel. The good woman sighed again, and shook her head dubiously. "You see, I knew her, sir," she replied, "and it isn't likely I could bring myself to think as hardly of her as the rest of the world. She was such a noble, generous creature. No one could ever have thought she would do such a wicked thing. She hadn't been here very long before I found out the love was all on one side in that marriage. She was very gentle and winning in all her ways towards her husband, but she didn't care for him, and never had cared for him, and never would. That was plain enough to me. She wasn't happy. To do what he would to please her, he couldn't make her happy. There was a look in her face of missing something, a sort of blank look, and whenever her husband was away, though goodness knows what that was not often, she would roam about the house in a restless way that gave one the dismals only to watch her." "Did he see that she was unhappy, do you think?" asked the colonel. "No, sir, I don't think he did, and that's why it came upon him like a thunderclap when she ran away. He was so bent upon making her happy that I think he believed she was too. She was so. He was proud of her too. Everybody admired her. She was the loveliest woman in the county, they said, though the West is famous for pretty women, and she was so clever, such a sweet singer. It was she who painted all the pictures in this room and in the hall. It was Mr. Hammersley's fancy to have none but what she had painted." "Did she belong to this part of the country?" "Oh, dear, no, sir. Her family were Suffolk people, I've heard say. Her father was a colonel in the Indian Army, and there was a very large family of them, not too well off, I believe, so of course it was a very good match for her. I suppose she married to please her friends. Such things seem common enough nowadays. She was always very sweet-spoken and affable with me. One day when I was talking to her of a son of mine, my only child, that died young, she said, "Ah, Mrs. Johns, I have my dead too." And I fancied she was speaking of some sweetheart very like that she'd had in time past. Did Captain Champney come here as Hammersley's friend? No, sir. He never came to this house at all. She must have met him out of doors. It was summertime, midsummer, and very sultry weather. Mr. Hammersley was up in London on business connected with his estate. He was to be away a week at most, and had wanted her to go with him, but she wouldn't, not being over well or strong at the time. She'd had a low nervous fever in the spring that had pulled her down a good deal. It was the morning after her husband left. I remember it all as well as if it was yesterday. She had been out in the village and round about the lanes visiting the poor. She was a rare hand at that always. And she came in at one of those windows while I was dusting the china in this room. I never shall forget her. Her face was white as a sheet, and she walked up in a strange tottering way with her eyes fixed until she came right up against me. Then she gave a start and dropped into the nearest chair, half fainting. I brought her a glass of water and asked her what happened. "Oh, Mrs. Johns," she said, "I've seen a ghost." I couldn't get her to say more than this. All the rest of the day she was shut up in her room. The next day there came a messenger with a letter for her, and late in the afternoon the same man came again with another letter. They were both from the captain, of course, but all that day she never stirred outside the doors, not so much as to go into the gardens, though it was a splendid summer day. Early the next morning there came another letter, and in the afternoon she went out. She wore her garden hat and a light muslin dress, and she took nothing with her. I could lay my life that when she left the house that afternoon she had no thought of going away. But she never came back. Were the two seen together in this neighbourhood? Yes. A lad met Mrs. Hammersley and a strange gentleman in Farmer Goldman's field. There's a shortcut across that way to the Penjuda Road. She had her hands clasped over her face and was sobbing as if her heart would break, the boy said, and the gentleman was talking to her very earnestly. The boy turned and watched them. They loitered about, talking for half an hour or so, Mrs. Hammersley crying almost all the time, and then the boy saw them get into a close carriage that had been waiting in the Penjuda Road, and heard the gentleman tell the man to drive to the station. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the Plymouth train leaves Penjuda at 5:15. It came out afterwards that Captain Champney had been staying at the Rose and Crown at Penjuda, and had hired a close fly on that day. The driver could tell all the rest, how he had waited above an hour in the road near Trewardle and picked up a lady there. How soon did Hammersley learn what had happened? My husband telegraphed to him that night, and he was back early the next morning. He was very quiet. I never saw anyone take a great blow so quietly. He didn't bluster or rave, as some gentlemen would have done, but he sat in the library for one whole day, writing letters and seeing everyone who had anything to tell him, while Andrew was about making inquiries. While Andrew was about making inquiries quietly in every direction. There was no fuss or talk, considering, and it was only a few people knew anything of what had happened. As soon as Mr. Hammersley had heard all he could hear in this place, he started off, after those two, I suppose, and that's the last we ever saw of him. He wrote to Andrew soon after, telling him how the house was to be kept up and so on, and that was all. "You heard of Captain Champney's death, I suppose?" said the Colonel. "Yes," Mrs. Johns replied with a doubtful air. "We did hear that he was dead." "And you heard the strange manner of his death, no doubt?" "We saw something in the papers, but didn't take much heed of it," replied Mrs. Johns, with an air of not caring to pursue this subject. The Colonel did not press it. There was no doubt in his own mind as to the hand that had slain Captain Champney, and he fancied that Mrs. Johns shared his conviction upon the subject. "Have you ever heard what became of Mrs. Hammersley?" he asked presently. "Not a word, sir, and that's what makes me pity her sometimes, in spite of myself. It's a hard thing for her to be left like that, without a soul to care for her. Him that she sinned for dead and gone. She may be starving somewhere. Poor, misguided creature, without a roof to cover her, perhaps, and these empty rooms looking as if they were waiting for her all the while, with all the pretty things she was so fond of just as she left them. It always gives me the heartache to think of her, or to touch any of the things that belongs to her. Was it Hammersley's wish that the place should be kept? Sorry, was it Hammersley's wish that the place should be kept just as she left it? Yes, sir. That was one of his orders in the letter of instruction that he wrote to my husband before he left England. Is there a portrait of her anywhere in the house? No, sir. There was a likeness of her, painted by some great artist in London, but I never saw that day. But I never saw that after the day when Mr. Hammersley came back and found her gone. When he destroyed it, whether he destroyed it in secret that day, or put it away somewhere under lock and key, I can't tell. I only know that when I came into this room next morning, the picture was gone. There's a blank space where it hung just above your head. The Colonel looks up. Yes, there was an empty panel. On the opposite side of the fireplace there was a portrait of his friend, little more than a head, against a dark background, bold and truthful, by the hand of John Philip. He had made a shrewd guess why the companion picture was missing. He had been so much interested in the housekeeper's talk as almost to forget his pain and weariness, but by this time the stimulating effect of his dose of brandy and water had worn off, and he felt really ill, quite as ill as when the first warning of his fever came upon him up the country. "I'm afraid I'm in for it, Mrs. Johns," he said with a faint groan. "I'm afraid I'm going to be very ill. Rather hard upon you and your husband, isn't it, and not in the bond? My friend lent me his house to get well in. He didn't bargain for my falling ill in it." Mrs. Johns did her best to console and cheer him with assurances that his symptoms indicated nothing more than a cold and a little over-fatigue. "A cold's a hazardous thing for a man in my condition, my good soul," said the Colonel, "and I was a fool to overdo it with those long tramps over the damp stubble. The doctor who sent me home gave me all manner of solemn warnings as to what I might and might not do, and I'm afraid I've paid very little attention to any of them. However, I'll go to bed at once, take a dose of the fellow's medicine, and wrap myself in a blanket. Perhaps I may be all right in the morning. But if I should be worse, you'd better telegraph to Plymouth for one of the best medical men there. Don't put me in the hands of a local doctor." Mrs. Johns promised to obey these instructions, still protesting that the Colonel would be better in the morning, and then hurried off to see that there was a blazing fire made in the bedroom, and to provide one of her thickest blankets in which to envelop him. Part 3. Ah, homeless as the leaf that winds have blown to earth, in this wide world I stand alone. The Colonel's dismal prophecy was but too faithfully realized. The next morning found him in a raging fever, with a furred tongue, bloodshot eyes, a galloping pulse, and racking pains in his limbs. It was no case of infection, no village epidemic. The Colonel had simply, in his own language, overdone it. Mrs. Johns opined that this was the beginning of a rheumatic fever, but she still kept up her cheery tone to the patient, looking anxiously all the while for the advent of the Plymouth doctor. He did not come till sunset, by which time the Colonel was worse. After making a careful examination of his patient, and questioning Mrs. Johns closely as to the Colonel's antecedents, the physician sat down to write a prescription. "It is not so much a question of physic as of care," he said. "You have not called in anyone from the neighbourhood yet, I suppose?" "No, sir. Colonel Benyon begged me not to call in anyone of that kind, or else I should have sent at once for Mr. Borlase." "Never mind what the Colonel says. Let your husband call for Mr. Borlase and get this prescription made up. He can ask Mr. Borlase to come back with him and see me, or, let me see, there'll scarcely be time for that. I can call on Borlase as I drive back to the station and explain matters. Mr. Borlase will watch the case for me." "But you'll come to see him again, sir?" "Most decidedly. This is Friday. I shall come again on Monday by the same train. The case is rather a critical one." "You don't think there's any danger, sir?" "Not immediate danger, but the man's constitution has been undermined by hard work and illness in India, and he's not a good subject for rheumatic fever. However, I shall be able to say more on Monday. In the meantime, the grand question is good nursing. I think I had better send you a professional nurse." Mrs. Johns protested her ability to nurse the Colonel herself, but the physician shook his head. "My good creature, you have your house to look after," he said, "and that poor fellow will want constant watching. We must expect delirium in such a case. You and your husband must contrive to look after him tonight, and I will send you a reliable person early tomorrow morning." Having made this promise, the doctor got into the fly from the Rose and Crown and drove back to Penjuda, where he had a brief interview with Mr. Borlase, who came out of his trim-looking stone house and stood upon the pavement before his door while the great man talked to him out of the fly. "I shall send a nurse from Plymouth tomorrow morning," said the physician. "There's no one about here, I suppose, that one could depend upon for such a case?" "I don't know about that," replied Mr. Borlase. There's a person I've had a good deal to do with lately amongst my very poor patients, and if you could only get her, you'd find her a treasure. But whether she would attend a wealthy person as a paid servant is a question I can't answer. She has only nursed the poor hereabouts, and evidently does it as a pious duty. I fancy, from her dress and manner, that she belongs to some religious community. Not exactly Roman Catholic, perhaps, but very near it." "Who is she?" "A Mrs. Chapman, a widow. Poor herself, I suppose, for she occupies very humble lodgings in Bolter's Row, at the other end of the town. She never takes payment from anyone. Indeed, she only attends a class that are quite unable to pay. She's a young woman, fragile-looking and very pretty, but she is the best nurse I ever met with." "I don't think the Colonel will object to her youth and good looks," said the doctor, laughing. "That kind of thing is much pleasanter in a sick room than some gorgon of the Gamp species. Have you known this Mrs. Chapman long?" "Not long. She has only been here 3 months, but I've seen a great deal of her in that time, and I can answer for her patience and devotion." "I've half an hour to spare before my train starts. I'll go down to Bolter's Row and have a look at this paragon of yours." "I'm sure you'll be pleased with her, but I very much doubt your being able to get her to do what we want," said Mr. Borlase. "We'll see about that," answered the physician, who had some confidence in his own powers of persuasion. "You say the woman is poor. She'll scarcely care to decline an advantageous offer, I should think. Good night, Borlase. Be sure you go to Trewardle the first thing tomorrow." With this injunction, the doctor drove away down the little hilly high street to the outskirts of Penjuda, where he alighted, and groped his way along a narrow alley of queer old-fashioned cottages, so crooked that they seemed scarcely able to support themselves in a standing position. Upon inquiring for Mrs. Chapman, he was directed to the last house in Bolter's Row, and here he was ushered into a tiny sitting-room, daintily neat, with an air of freshness and prettiness that struck him as something beyond the common graces of poverty. The room was dimly lighted by one candle, beside which a woman sat reading, a slim, fragile creature in a black gown with a white muslin cap of some peculiar fashion, a cap which concealed almost every vestige of her hair, and gave a nun-like aspect to her pale, thin face. The doctor felt at once that this was no vulgar sick nurse. This was not a woman to whom he could broadly offer money as an inducement to her to depart from her established round of duty. He told her his errand, told her what he had heard from Mr. Borlase, and how anxious he was to secure her services for a gentleman lying dangerously ill. "It is quite impossible," she said in a sweet, firm voice. "I nurse only the very poor." "You belong to some sisterhood, I suppose?" said the physician. "No, I belong to no sisterhood," she answered, with something that was half bitterness, half sorrow in her tone. "I stand quite alone in the world." "Pray, pardon me. I thought by your dress you might be a member of one of those communities so numerous nowadays." "No, sir. It is a simple dress, and suits my circumstances. That is my only reason for wearing it. I have made my own line of duty, and try to follow it." "I wonder you should have chosen so obscure a place as Penjuda as a field for your charitable work. Do you belong to this part of the country?" "No. The place is quiet, and I can live cheaply here. Up to this time I have always found plenty of work." "The duty you have chosen is a very noble one, and the sacrifice most admirable in so young a woman." "It is no sacrifice for me," she answered decisively, and the doctor felt he had no right to ask any more questions. He pressed his request very warmly, however, so much so that at last Mrs. Chapman seemed almost inclined to yield. "You have owned that you have no pressing duties in Penjuda just now," he said, when they had been talking together for some time, "and I do assure you that you will be performing a real act of charity in looking after this poor fellow at Trewardle." It was the first time he had mentioned the name of the place. "Trewardle, did you say?" asked Mrs. Chapman. "Yes, it's a gentleman's house 7 miles from here, a charming place. This Colonel Benyon is a friend of the owner, who has lived abroad for some years. Pray, now, consider the case and extend your charity to this poor man, Mrs. Chapman. Remember, it's not as if he were in the bosom of his family. He's quite alone, with no one in the house but servants, and a stranger in the land, as one may say. Of course, I might send a nurse from Plymouth, as I intended in the first case, but after what Mr. Borlase told me, I set my heart upon having you." "Mr. Borlase is very good. I will come." He had expected to conquer in the end, but had not expected her to yield so suddenly. "You will? That's capital. Allow me to say that, as far as remuneration goes, you will be quite at liberty to name your own terms." "Pray do not mention that. I could not possibly take payment for my services. I shall come to Colonel Benyon as I should to the poorest patient in Penjuda." "Do just what you please, only come, and the sooner the better." "I can come immediately, tonight, if you please." "I should be very glad if you will do so. I am just off to the station, and will send my fly to take you back to Trewardle." "Back to Trewardle," Mrs. Chapman repeated those 3 last words, as if there were something strange in them. The doctor was too hurried to notice anything peculiar in her tone. As it was, he ran some risk of losing his train. He wished her good night, and went back to the fly. And that's where I shall take a break. So yeah, we now go into a break. But hey, Yumiko, welcome. Having a hard mental health day, stories are appreciated. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm glad to be doing something that hopefully helps. But yeah, gonna go to a quick break. If I remember what the shortcut for the big screen is, it's that one. And yeah, get up, have a stretch, walk around if you need. That can constitute stretching, rotate your fluids, stretch your legs and that sort of thing. And we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes or so. Goodbye for now. Well, hello. Seems that we're back from the break, and yeah, I hope that everyone is well and enjoying things so far. I'm not as cold as I expected to be. The heating was doing its work combined with the blanket, so I'm happy to report that. Joey's just happily asleep on the bed. Probably not going to interrupt the second half of this, which is nice. Unless he does, that happens too. But yeah, Lynn, I'm glad that you are enjoying the story so far, finding it interesting. It's from what I've read, obviously so far aloud, and what I read of the rest of it earlier, it's still not one that I would classify as a horror story. But yeah, it's more of just like a bit of a mystery, intriguing kind of thing. And mainly I just like that it's set in Cornwall, and with lots of lovely description of Cornwall, because that's a place that I really do love. And yeah, it's nice to be transported there via the medium of description. And we've got a blanket, have we? Very nice. Yes, we have indeed got a blanket. I fetched one because it's cold. I guess winter's coming around for another go, which is always exciting. And yeah, I don't know. You probably heard the siren earlier from wherever that was rushing off to, but I don't know whether you're getting the wind and rain through the mic, but there's certainly a lot of that about tonight, which is again adding to the mood. So that's cool. But yeah, I guess I'll probably have some water and crack on with things. Yeah, it's a cool thing to do. This water still tastes of washing up liquid from yesterday, but that's fine. It's better than what it was tasting of. Hush, water bottle. I need a quieter one. That's what I need. That'll be my next investment. But yeah, if we're all good, then I shall continue. Part 4. There are some things hard to understand. Oh, help me, my God, to trust in thee, but I never shall forget her soft white hand, and her eyes when she looks at me. Colonel Benyon had a hard time of it. Again, as in his Indian bungalow, grim death claimed him for his own, and was only to be kept at bay by prodigies of care and skill. Again the lamp of life flickered low, and for a while the sick man lay in a land where all was darkness, knowing no one, remembering nothing, and suffering the unspeakable agonies of a mind distraught. There is no need to describe the variations of the fever, the changes from bad to worse, the faint improvement, the threatened relapse. Through all that, the month of September, Mr. Borlase came twice a day, and the Plymouth physician twice a week to Trewardle. They both declared themselves proud of their victory when Herbert Benyon could be fairly pronounced out of danger. They both acknowledged that they owed that victory, under Providence, to Mrs. Chapman. She had been indefatigable, working and watching by day and night with a quiet patience that knew no limit. No other hand than hers had ever administered the Colonel's medicine, or smoothed his pillow since she came to Trewardle. No eyes but hers had watched him in the dead of night. It was quite in vain that Mr. Borlase and Mr. Johns had urged her to accept assistance, to let some one relieve her of her night watch now and then. Upon this point she was inexorable. If she ever slept at all, she so planned her slumbers that they should not interfere with her duties. Sometimes in the dusk of the evening, when it was very nearly dark even out of doors, she would take a solitary walk in the gardens for half an hour or so. That was her only relaxation. Sweet and gentle as she was in her manners, she was rather an unapproachable person, and she contrived to keep Mrs. Johns at a distance, which was somewhat galling to that matron, who had never been able to beguile her into a little friendly gossip since she entered the house. "She's as proud as Lucifer, I do believe, in spite of her meek, quiet ways," Mrs. Johns declared to her husband with an aggrieved expression of countenance. "Why, I've scarcely heard her voice half a dozen times since she's been here, and I can't say that I've seen her face properly yet. That black hood she wears overshadows it so. I hate such poppish ways." This hood, which Mrs. Johns objected to, had certainly a somewhat conventional aspect, and served to hide the nurse's pale, sweet face much more than the cap in which Dr. Matson had first seen her. The physician perceived the change of headgear when he came to Trewardle, but considered it only a part of that harmless eccentricity which might be permitted to this lay sister of charity. The time came at last when Herbert Benyon awoke from that long night of suffering and delirium to some faint interest in external things. He had not been unconscious all this time. On the contrary, for long afterwards he had a keen remembrance of every detail of his illness, but mixed up with all the realities of his life had been the dreams and delusions of fever. He knew that throughout his illness, by day and night, a slender, black-robed figure had sat by his bedside, or flitted lightly about his room. He knew that a woman's soft hand had administered to his comforts day after day, without change or weariness. He knew that a very sweet, sad face had looked down upon him in the dim lamplight with ineffable pity. But he had cherished strange fancies about this gentle watcher. Sometimes she was a sister that he had loved very dearly and lost in his early youth. Sometimes she was Lady Julia D'Ursay. That she resembled neither of them mattered little to his wandering mind. But this was all over now. He knew that he was at Trewardle, and that this black-robed woman was a stranger to him. It was upon a Sunday, a mild October day towards sunset, that he felt himself for the first time able to speak to his patient nurse. A broad bay window in his room looked westward, and he saw the evening sky with a warm rosy light in it, and heard the rooks cawing in the avenue, and the church bells ringing for evening service. Mrs. Chapman was sitting by the window reading, with her hood thrown back and her dark brown hair only shrouded by her muslin cap. She did not wear the hood always, though Mrs. Johns had never happened to see her without it. She had a habit of throwing it off at times. The Colonel lay quite motionless, looking at the sky and at that quiet figure by the window, wondering dreamily who this woman was. Her profile was clearly defined against the soft light as she sat there, unconscious that he was watching her, and Herbert Benyon thought that he had never seen a lovelier face. It was a spiritualized beauty, sublimated by some great sorrow, the Colonel fancied. The glory and bloom of youth were gone, though the woman was evidently young, but with the loss of these she had gained in the charm of expression. It was a face that went to one's heart. She turned from the window presently, hearing her patient stir, and came towards the bed. He saw that her eyes were grey, large and dark, with a plaintive look in them. "I did not know that you were awake," she said gently. "Let me alter your pillows a little, and then I will bring you some tea." It was the voice that had been with him in all his foolish dreams. It seemed as if he had come back to life out of a living grave, bringing only this memory with him. She bent over him, arranging the pillow which had slipped to a position of torture on the edge of the bed. The dexterous hands made all comfortable in a few moments, while the lovely face looked down upon him. "How good you have been to me all this time," he said. He had uttered protestations of gratitude and regard many times during his delirium, but these were the first thoroughly sensible words he had spoken to her. The surprise overcame her a little. Sudden tears started to her eyes, and she turned her head aside to hide them. "Thank God!" she exclaimed earnestly. "Thank God!" "For what?" asked the Colonel. "That you are so much better." "I have been very ill, then, I suppose?" "You have been very ill." "Off my head, haven't I?" "Yes, I know I thought myself up the country, and I could hear the jackals screaming outside. And I am really in Cornwall, down at Hammersley's place." "Poor Hammersley. And you have been nursing me for I don't know how long. You see I am quite rational now. I thought once you were my sister, a girl who died nearly 20 years ago." "Yes, you are much better, but pray do not talk. You are very weak still, and the doctors would be angry with me for letting you talk so much." "Very well, I will be as quiet as a lamb. Indeed, I don't feel capable of disobeying you. But there is one question that I must ask." "I do not mind answering one question if I can." "To what beneficent influence do I owe your care of me? What freak of fortune brought such a ministering angel to my sickbed? I am here to perform a work of charity, that is all, she answered quietly. I am a nurse by profession. But you are a lady, he exclaimed, surprised. That does not prevent my nursing the sick. Then you do not mean you are a hospital nurse, a person to be engaged by anyone who needs your services? You are asking more than one question. No, I am not a hospital nurse, nor do I take payment for my services. I thought not, murmured the colonel with a faint sigh of relief. It would have shocked him somehow to discover that the patient watcher whom he had mistaken now for his lost sister, anon for his false love, was only a hireling after all. I wished to perform some duty in the world, being quite alone, and I chose that of attendance on the sick poor. I have never wearied of it yet. And have you been long engaged in this good work? Not very long, but you must not talk any more. I must positively forbid that. The colonel submitted very reluctantly. He was so eager to know all about this woman, this ministering angel as he called her in his own mind. He repeated Scott's familiar lines in a low voice as she moved softly about the room, making preparations for his evening meal. Betsy Jane, the fat-faced housemaid, brought the tea tray. Mrs. Johns had avoided all actual attendance on the sick room of late, offended by the nurse's standoffishness. The colonel did not want her, she said. He had that fine lady with her poppish headgear. Mrs. Chapman arranged the tea things on the table by the bed. The small home-baked loaf, the tiny rolls of rich yellow butter, and a noble block of honeycomb on a glass dish. There was a nosegay of autumnal flowers, too, for the embellishment of the table, and altogether Herbert Benyon fancied that innocent repast the most tempting banquet that had ever been spread before him. "Please sit there and pour out my tea," he said in his weak voice. "But see, you have forgotten your own cup and saucer," he added, looking at the table. "I will drink my tea presently." "You must drink it now, with me, or I will drink none." She complied. It's not worthwhile arguing with him about such a trifle. She brought the second cup and saucer and sat where he ordered her. He looked at her very often as he sipped the tea she had poured out for him, and ate the bread and honey, like the queen in the famous nursery rhyme. He looked at her, wondering what her life had been, with an intense curiosity only possible to a prisoner in a sick room. He would have given the world to question her father, but that was forbidden, to say nothing of the impertinence of such a proceeding. He was fain to lie there, and look at her with fixed, dreamy eyes, speculating idly about her and her history. The patient had taken a turn, and the doctors rejoiced exceedingly, but his progress even now was very slow. He lay for 4 long weeks, almost as helpless as a child, attended upon day and night by Mrs. Chapman and a young man out of the stables, a handy young fellow whose genius had been developed by the exigencies of the case, and who had made a very decent amateur valet. How he should have endured this dreary time without Mrs. Chapman's care and companionship, Herbert Benyon could not imagine. She brightened the dismal monotony of the sick room, and lightened his burden for him more than words could tell. And yet she was by no means what anyone would call a lively person. Indeed, after that close companionship of many weeks, Colonel Benyon could not remember ever having seen her smile. But her presence had an influence upon him that was better than commonplace cheerfulness. She read to him, and the low, sweet voice was like music. She talked to him, and every word helped to reveal the wealth of a highly cultivated mind. With such a companion, life could not be irksome, even in a sick room. Before the 4th week of the first stage of his convalescence was ended, Colonel Benyon had made many efforts to learn his nurse's history, but had failed utterly in the endeavour. "My story is common enough," she told him once, when he said that he was convinced there was some romance in her life. "I have lost all that I ever loved, and am obliged to interest myself in strangers." "You are very young to be a widow," said the colonel. "Had you been long married when Mr. Chapman died?" A sudden look of pain came to her face. "Not very long. Please do not ask me to recall my past life. My history is the history of the dead." After this he could not push his curiosity further. But he was not a little tormented by his desire to know more. In the dead of the night he lay awake, saying to himself, "Who the deuce could this Chapman have been to leave his wife in such a desolate position? And what has become of her own relations? I would stake my chances of promotion that she is a lady by birth. But how comes a lady to be left to carry out such quixotic scheme as this sick nursing business?" For, to the Colonel's mundane mind, the nursing of the sick poor seemed an eccentric and abnormal employment for a well-bred young woman. Above all, for a beautiful woman like this widow, with the classic profile and luminous grey eyes. As soon as the Colonel was strong enough to totter from his bed to a sofa, Dr. Matson suggested a change of quarters. "You must get nearer the sea," he said. "This flowery dell is all very well in its way, and you certainly do get a sniff of the Atlantic mixed with the perfume of your roses, but I should like to plant you somewhere on the very edge of the ocean. There is a decent inn at Penjuda, now directly facing the sea, built almost upon the beach, a homely place enough, but where you would get very good treatment. I think we might move you there with advantage." The Colonel groaned. "I don't feel strong enough to be moved from one room to another," he said. "I dare say not. There's a good deal of prostration still, no doubt, but the change would do you a world of good. We must manage it somehow. Contrive some kind of ambulance and carry you in a recumbent position. Mrs. Chapman will go with you, of course." The Colonel's face brightened at this suggestion. "Would you go?" he asked, looking at his nurse. "Of course she would. She's not done with you yet, by any means. You are not going to slip out of our hands for some little time, I assure you, Colonel Benyon," said Dr. Matson, with professional jocosity. "I do not wish. I am quite content to remain an invalid," replied the Colonel, looking at his nurse and not at the doctor. The physician saw the look. "Bless my soul," he said to himself, "is that the way the cat jumps? The Colonel's friends won't thank me for getting him such a good nurse if he winds up marrying her. That look was very suspicious." The doctor had his way. The chief inn at Penjuda was quite empty at this late period of the year, and the best rooms, old-fashioned, capacious chambers facing the sea, were at the patient's disposal. So one fine morning in the beginning of November, while the reddened leaves in this mild western country still lingered on the trees, Colonel Benyon left Trewardle, which had been a somewhat unlucky shelter, it seemed. Even on that last morning, busy Mrs. Johns scarcely caught so much as a glimpse of the nurse's face, but just at the final moment, when the Colonel had been made comfortable in the carriage, wrapped up to the eyes in woolen rugs and tiger skins, Mrs. Chapman turned and held out her hand to the housekeeper. She had her veil down, a thick black veil, and she wore a close black bonnet of a somewhat bygone fashion. "Goodbye, Mrs. Johns," she said in her low, plaintive voice. "This is the last time I shall ever see Trewardle. Please shake hands before I go away." There was something that seemed almost humility in her tone. The housekeeper drew herself up rather stiffly, quite taken by surprise, and then, in the next moment, her good nature got the better of her resentment, and she took the proffered hand. What a slender little hand it seemed in the grasp of Sarah John's stout fingers. "I am sure I bear you no malice, Mum," she said, "though you have kept yourself so much to yourself, as if other folks weren't good enough for you. And if you like to walk over from Penjuda any fine afternoon to take a cup of tea with me and my husband, you'll be heartily welcome. There's always a bit of cold meat and an apple pasty in the house. You are very kind, but I feel somehow that I shall never see Trewardle again. May I gather one of those late roses? Thanks, I should like to take one away." She went to one of the standard rose trees on the lawn and gathered one solitary tea rose, a pale primrose-coloured flower, a melancholy-looking blossom, the Colonel thought, when she took her seat in the carriage with this rose in her hand. "I don't like to see you with that pale yellow flower," he said. "It reminds me of asphodel, and seems symbolical of death. I should like to do away with that ugly black bonnet, and crown you with a garland of bright red roses, the emblems of renewed youth and hope." She looks at him with sad, earnest eyes. "I have done with youth," she said, "and with hope, except—" "Except what?" he asked eagerly. "Except a hope that I do not care to talk about, the hope of something beyond this earth." After this, the colonel was silent. There was something in those grave words that sounded like a reproof. Mrs. Johns stood in the porch watching the carriage drive away with a thoughtful countenance. "What was in her voice just now that gave me the shivers?" she said to herself, perplexed in spirit. Part 5. So may one read his weird, and reason, and with vain drugs assuage no pain, for each man in his loving season fools and is fooled of these in vain. Charms that allay not any longing, spells that appease not any grief, time brings us all by handfuls wronging, all hurts with nothing of relief. Colonel Benyon was in love. That rigid disciplinarian, that battered soldier who had boasted for the last 15 years of his freedom from anything approaching what he called an entanglement, now awoke to the consciousness that he was the veriest fool in the universe, and that unless he could win this woman, of whose antecedents he knew nothing, for his wife, he was a lost man. That he could return to the outer world, that he could go back to India and begin life again without her, seemed to him impossible. His world had narrowed itself into the sick chamber where she ministered to him. All the voices of this earth seemed to have melted into that one low, tender voice that read to him or talked with him in the long, tranquil evenings. Until now he had scarcely known the meaning of a woman's companionship. Never had he lived in such close intimacy with anyone, not even a masculine friend. But now he looked back at his hard, commonplace life, the conventional society, the stereotyped pleasures, and wondered how he had endured so many years of such a barren existence. He loved her. For a long time, his idle weeks in that sick room had seemed so long, giving him so much leisure for thought. He had struggled against this folly, if folly it were, but he had struggled in vain. He loved her. Her and none other would he have for his wife, and he told himself that it was, after all, no great sacrifice which he contemplated making. That she was a lady he had never doubted from the first hour when, restored to his sober senses, he had looked at her face and heard her voice. It was just possible that she was born of a less noble race than his own, though he could scarcely bring himself to believe even this. It was more than probable that she was very poor. The colonel was glad of this last fact. It pleased him to think that his wealth might give her a new and brighter life, surrounding her with all those luxuries and elegancies which seemed the natural attributes of her beauty. Was there any hope for him? Well, yes, he was inclined to believe his case far from desperate. There was a subtle something in her looks and tones at times that made him fancy he was not quite indifferent to her, that he was more than the mere object of her charity. Nothing could be more vague than these signs and tokens, for she was the most reserved of women, the proudest, he sometimes thought, and he felt convinced that she was herself unconscious of them. But, slight as they were sufficient to kindle hope in Herbert Benyon's breast, and he fancied that he had only to wait the fullness of time for the hour of his confession and the certainty of his happiness. He was not eager to speak. There was time enough. This tranquil daily intercourse was so sweet to him that he almost feared to end it by assuming a new relation to his gentle nurse. He did not want to scare her away just yet, even if she left him only to come back to him later as his wife. He wanted to have her all to himself a little longer in this easy, undisturbed companionship. So the days and weeks went on. The colonel grew so much stronger that Dr. Matson bade him goodbye, and even Mr. Borlase began to talk of releasing him. He was able to take a short stroll in the sunniest hour of the autumn day, leaning on his cane and occasionally getting a little help from his nurse's supporting arm. He was very fond of Penjudah, The scattered houses on the seashore, the curious old-fashioned high street straggling up a hill, the sheltered nook upon the grassy hillside that served as a burial ground for the population at Penjuda, the rustic lanes from which one looked right out upon the broad Atlantic. All these things grew very dear to the Colonel, and it seems to him that he could be content to live in this remote western haven forever, with this one woman for his companion. It was very nearly the end of November, but the weather was wonderfully mild in this region. The days bright and balmy, the evenings clear and calm. The Colonel stopped to rest sometimes in the burial ground, seated on a moss-grown granite tomb, with his face towards the sea and Mrs. Chapman by his side. He had told her all the story of his past life, even that ignominious episode of Lady Julia D'Ursay's ill-treatment. It was his delight to talk to her. He confided in her as he had never done in anyone else. He had such unbounded faith in her integrity, such a fixed belief in her good sense. He had talked to her of his friend Hammersley, and had told her of the story of the guilty mistress of Trewardle. "Strange that we should have both come to grief about a woman, isn't it?" he asked, and Mrs. Chapman owned that it was very strange. "You'd heard the story before, I dare say," remarked the Colonel. "I suppose all the gossips of Penjuda know it by heart." "Yes," she answered, "everybody in Cornwall knows it." It was the last day of November. Mr. Borlase had again talked about taking leave of his patient, and the Colonel was sitting on his favourite tomb, the memorial of some race whose grandeur was a memory of the past. He began to think the time was drawing near when he must make his confession and hear his fate. He was no coxcomb, yet he had no fear of the result. Indeed, he was certain that she loved him. While he was meditating in a dreamy way, in no hurry to speak, and quite satisfied with the happiness of having a woman he loved by his side, Mrs. Chapman suddenly broke the silence. "You are so much better, Colonel Benyon," she began. "Almost well, indeed, Mr. Borlase says, that I think you can afford to spare me now. I have stayed with you already much longer than I felt to be really necessary, only—" She hesitated, just for a moment, and then went rapidly on. "Only yours was a critical case, and I did not wish to leave you while there was the faintest chance of relapse. There is no fear of that now, and I am wanted elsewhere. There is a little boy in one of the cottages up the hill dying of consumption. His mother came to the hotel to speak to me last night, and I have promised her to go to him this evening." "This evening?" cried the Colonel aghast. "You mean to leave me this evening?" "To go to a dying child, yes, Colonel Benyon," the nurse answered reproachfully. "There is so little that I can do for you now, for I suppose you may be trusted to take your medicines regularly. You really do not want me any longer." "I do not want you any longer," repeated the Colonel. "I want you all my life. I want you for my wife," he went on, laying his hand upon her shoulder. "I cannot live without you. You must stay with me, dearest, or only leave me to come back to me as my wife. We have no need of a long courtship. I think we know each other thoroughly as it is." "You think you know me thoroughly as it is?" the woman echoed, shrinking away from him, and standing with her face turned towards the sea, only the profile visible to the Colonel, and upon that the impress of a misery that struck him to his soul. "My dear love, what is this?" he asked. "Have I distressed you so much by my avowal? Am I so utterly repugnant to you?" "Your wife," she murmured, as if she had scarcely heard his last words. "Your wife." "Yes, dearest, my beloved and honoured wife. I did not believe it was in my nature to love any one as I love you." "That any man upon this earth should care for me," she murmured. "You, above all other men." And then, turning to him with a calmer face, she said decisively, "That can never be, Colonel Benyon. You and I can never be more to one another than we have been. The wisest thing you can do is to wish me good-bye here where we stand, and forget that you have ever known me." "This is just the last thing possible to me," he answered impetuously. There is nothing upon this earth I care to live for, if I cannot have you for my wife. You must have known that I loved you. You had no right to stay with me so long. You had no right to let me love you, if you meant to treat me like this at the last. But you do not mean to be so cruel. You are only trying me. You are only playing with your victim. Oh, my darling, for pity's sake, tell me that I am not quite indifferent to you." "That is not the question." the woman replied quietly. "Have you thought of what you are doing, Colonel Benyon? Have you counted the cost? Have you thought what it is to entrust your name and your honor to the keeping of a woman of whom you know nothing?" "I know that you are an angel," he said, putting his arm around the slender figure, trying to draw her to his breast. Again she shrank from him, this time with a gesture so repellent that he drew back involuntarily, chilled to the heart. "Do not touch me," she said. "You do not know who and what I am." "I ask to know nothing," he cried vehemently. If there is any secret in your past life that might divide us, hide it from me. Do you think I am going to bring the scrutiny of a detective to bear upon the antecedents of the woman I love? Blindly I give my happiness and honor into your keeping. I see you and love you for what you are, not for what evil fortune may have made you in the past." "You do not know the weight of your words," she answered sadly. "I thank you with all my heart for your confidence, for your love, but that which you think you wish can never be. It is best for us to part this very day, this very moment. Let us shake hands, Colonel Benyon, and say farewell." "Not till you have told me your reasons," the colonel cried imperiously. "I may know those at least." "I do not recognize your right to question me. I cannot explain my reasons." "But I will know them," he cried, seizing her wrist. "I have been fooled by one woman. I will not be trifled with by another. I will know why you refuse to be my wife. Is it because you hate or despise me?" No, you know it is not that." She looked at him piteously, with a look that said as plainly as any words she could have spoken, "You know that I love you." "Is it from any mistaken notion of fidelity to the dead? No, it is not that. Yet heaven knows I have reason to be faithful to the dead." "What is it, then? You must and shall tell me." "For pity's sake, spare me. You are torturing me, Colonel Benyon." "Give me your promise to be my wife, then, and I will not ask a question. There can be no strong reason enough to divide us, if you love me, and I think you do." "Heaven help me!" she sobbed, clasping her hands with a piteous gesture. To Herbert Benyon those 3 words sounded like a confession. He was sure that she loved him, sure that his will must conquer hers in the end. "Yes," she cried passionately, "I do love you. Nothing could excuse such an admission from my lips but the knowledge that in this hour we part forever. I do love you, Colonel Benyon, but there is nothing in this world that would induce me to become your wife, even if you knew the worst I can tell, and were yet willing to take me, which you would not be." "You are wrong," he exclaimed with an oath. "There is nothing you can tell me that can change my resolution or diminish my love." "Do not promise so rashly," she answered, ashy pale, and with tremulous lips. He drew her to the old granite tomb and persuaded her to sit down beside him, seeing that she was nearly fainting. "My love, I do not wish to be cruel," he said tenderly. "I do not seek to lift the veil of the past. I am content to love you blindly, foolishly, if you like. I will do anything to prove my devotion, will shape the whole course of my future life for your happiness. There is nothing in the world I would not sacrifice for your sake. Be generous for your part, dearest. Say that you will be my wife, or give me some adequate reason for your denial." She did not answer him immediately. There was a silence of some moments, and then she said, in a low voice, "You have a friend to whom you are very much attached, Colonel Benyon. A friend who is almost as dear to you as a brother. I have heard you say that." "What, Hammersley?" "Yes, certainly, Hammersley is a dear good fellow, but what has he to do with my marrying as I please? I should not consult him about that." "You were talking the other night of that guilty creature, his wife." "Yes, I have spoken to you about his wife." "You have, in terms of reprobation which were well deserved. Have pity upon me, Colonel Benyon. I am that wretched woman." She had slipped from the tombstone to the turf beside it, and remained there, half crouching, half kneeling, in her utter unabasement, with her face hidden. "You!" exclaimed the colonel in a thick voice. "You!" The blow seemed almost to crush him. He felt, for the moment, stupefied, stunned. He had been prepared for anything but this. "I am that wretched woman," I do not know if there is the shadow of excuse for my sin in the story of my life, but at any rate it is best that you should know it. George Champney and I were engaged to be married long before I saw Mr. Hammersley, and when he went to India, we were pledged to wait till he should come back and make me his wife. We had known each other from childhood, and I cannot tell you how dearly I loved him. It means a mockery now to speak of this when I have not even been faithful to his memory, but I did love him. I have mourned him as truly as ever any man was lamented upon this earth. From the first, my father was opposed to our engagement, and my stepmother, a very worldly woman, set her face against it most resolutely. But we braved their displeasure, and held our own in spite of them. It was only when George was gone that their persecution became almost unendurable to me. I need not enter into details. Captain Champney had been away more than 2 years when I first met Mr. Hammersley. We were forbidden to write to each other, and I had suffered unspeakable anxiety about him in the time. It was only in some indirect manner that I ever had news of him. When Mr. Hammersley first proposed to me, I refused him decisively. But then followed a weary time in which I was tormented by my stepmother, and even my father, who was influenced by her in this business. I do not think any man can understand the kind of domestic persecution which women are subject to, the daily reproach, the incessant worry. But I went through this ordeal. It was only when my father brought home a newspaper containing the announcement of George Champney's death that my courage gave way. They let me alone for some time after this, let me indulge my grief unmolested, and then, one day, the old arguments, the familiar reproaches began again, and in an hour of fatal weakness, worn out in body and mind, for I had been very ill for a long time after that bitter blow, I yielded. She paused for a little, but the colonel did not speak. He sat upon the granite tomb, looking seaward with haggard eyes, motionless as a statue, the living image of despair. He could have borne anything but this. You know the rest. No, you can never know how I suffered. The false announcement in the paper had been an error, common enough in those days, Captain Champney told me, when he came upon me one summer morning near Trewardle like a ghost. He had heard of the report in India, and had written to a common friend of ours, entreating her to let me know the truth. Whether she had attempted to do so, and had been in some manner prevented by my father or my stepmother, I cannot tell. Another Champney had been killed. The mistake was only the insertion of the wrong initials, but it was a fatal error for us too. He came to me to remind me of my promise, came determined to take me away from my husband. I cannot speak of the events that came afterwards. There was no such thing as happiness possible for either of us. We were not wicked enough to be happy in spite of our sin. You know how they found George Champney lying dead on the sands at Blankenberg one bright September morning. After that I had a dangerous illness, during which I was taken to a Belgian convent, by my husband's influence, I believe, where I was tenderly nursed till I recovered. They knew my story, those spotless nuns, and yet were kind to me. I stayed with them as a boarder for a year after Mr. Hammersley obtained his divorce, and it was there I learned to nurse the sick. I was not destitute. A sister of my mother's, knowing my position, settled a small annuity upon me, and on that I have lived ever since. 6 months ago I was seized with a yearning to see the place where the most tranquil days of my life had been spent. I knew that Mr. Hammersley was living abroad, and I fancied that I ran no risk of recognition in returning to this neighbourhood. I knew how much misery and illness had changed me since I left Trewardle. It was a foolish fancy, no doubt, but I, who had nothing human left to love, may be forgiven for a weak attachment to familiar places. I came to Penjuda, thinking that I should find plenty of work here of the kind I wanted. I had no intention of coming any nearer to Trewardle, where I must, of course, run considerable risk of being recognised. But when Dr. Matson urged me to come to you, the temptation was too strong for me, and I came to see the dear old place once more. That is the end of my story, and now, Colonel Benyon, I have but one more word to say. Farewell. She rose from the ground and was going to leave him, but he detained her. "You have almost broken my heart," he said, "but there is nothing in this world can change my love for you. I still ask you to be my wife. I promise to cherish you with a love that shall blot out the memory of your past." She shook her head sadly. "It can never be," she answered. "I am not vile enough to trade upon your weakness or your generosity. Let me be faithful to the dead and loyal to you. Once more, goodbye. Will nothing I can say prevail with you?" "Nothing. I shall always honor and revere you as the most generous of men, but you and I must never meet after today." He pleaded with her a little longer, trying by every possible argument to vanquish her resolution, but his endeavors were all in vain. He knew that she loved him. He felt that he was doomed to lose her. And so, at last, she left him, sitting in the quiet burial ground, in the pale winter sunshine, with all the glory of the Atlantic before him, and the stillness of a desert round about. Even after she had left him, he determined upon making one more attempt to win her. He found out the place where she lived, and went to that humble alley in the early dusk, bent upon seeing her once more, upon pleading his cause more calmly, more logically than it had been possible for him to do in the first heat of his passion. He found the house, and a very civil, good-natured woman, who told him that Mrs. Chapman had left Penjuda 2 hours before, for good. She had gone abroad, the woman said. To Belgium, I suppose? Yes, sir, that was the name of the place. As soon as he was strong enough, Colonel Benyon went to Belgium, where he spent a couple of months searching for Flora Hammersley in all the convents. It was a long, wearisome search, but he went through with it patiently to the end, persevering until he found a quiet little conventual retreat 6 miles from Louvain, where boarders were admitted. It was the place where she had been. His search was ended, and the woman he loved had been buried in the tiny convent cemetery just a week before he came there. After this, there was nothing left for the colonel but to go back to India to the old familiar life. It was only his closest friends who ever perceived the change in him, but although he never spoke of his trouble, those who did thoroughly know him knew that he had suffered some recent heart wound, and that the stroke had been a heavy one. And that's the end of the story. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to give myself a marker so that I can edit this more easily. Although this might be one where I end up putting the whole thing on YouTube instead of just the story, because there was a bit at the start where I was saying about how, yeah, it's obviously talk of a colonel. Being a colonel in India is very much like, yeah, this guy was colonial, which isn't something we endorse or support, and I said that at the start, and I want to say that again. Like, the story itself doesn't seem to be like, rah, the colonies were great or anything, but, you know, just want to be clear, like, that's not our jam. It's not cool, it's not good. And yeah, indeed, hey Thunder, hey Speedy. That's sort of a couple of books I might love to hear you guys read if you're ever looking for new ones. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's not weird at all. All good. Yeah, I mean, it depends on if they're ones that are in the public domain or not, but yeah, always. I mean, the rule is always happy to take suggestions if it's okay if we don't do it. But we will certainly, if you've got something to suggest, we'll certainly give it a look and give it a think. Thank you very much. And Speedy, yeah, hey, welcome. I hope that you are well. I hope that this evening finds you well. And yeah, you're welcome, Lynn. I'm happy to do it. I enjoy it. So yeah, moral of the story is, as Lucy's got it, women don't owe you marriage. I feel like there could be a bit of a discussion about this one, if people wish to have a discussion about this one, because, like, to me, I feel as if, obviously, it's all about Colonel Benyon. It's called Colonel Benyon's Entanglement, and he is the protagonist of the story. But my feeling is that he's not viewed as a good guy by the text. Like, I don't feel as if it's like he's doing all these things and the author, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, is there going like, and he's right to do it. Like, he's right to feel as if he's owed marriage. Exactly, protagonist does not equal hero. And that's why I felt okay reading this one, because yeah, to me his behavior is not good at all. It's very entitled and clingy and kind of goes all, yeah, kind of incel behavior of like, well, you owe me marriage, or if not, you owe me a reason why you shouldn't marry me. And like, yeah, denying her own agency in this. And well, there's a bit where it's like, wait, you're a woman and a nurse, which, you know, he obviously, yeah, he's just not that great a guy in any direction, really. And feels that, yeah, because he loves her. And that's where it kind of bothers me that in the end she herself is like, yeah, okay, look, I do actually love you, but also this is really awkward and difficult and weird for me, and I have to go. I kind of, to me, I would prefer it if she was like, no, dude, I was literally just your nurse and just looked after you for like a few months. That's great, but it was a professional relationship. Please don't get attached to your doctor. That's just weird. Which I'd have kind of, I guess, preferred that a little bit more. But that might just be me. But yeah, women don't owe you marriage just because you insist on it. Oh, and also, yeah, the bit where it's like, it's good that she's poor, because then I can provide her with all the nice things that she deserves. Like, that's not a good attitude, my dude. So yeah, those are my thoughts and feelings on it. As I said at the start, like, not it's in a book of horror stories, but it doesn't. I mean, I guess in some ways it's kind of horrifying, but not in conventional like, whoa, spooky ghost or murder man. It's a power dynamic waiting to be exploited. Yep, exactly. So yeah, and again, it's like if this were the sort of relationship power dynamic thing that were being, I feel, treated uncritically by the work, I would be a lot more reluctant to read it, because let's face it, that sort of thing gets written a lot, and people read that and go, sick, yeah, that's cool, that's how men should treat women. And my feeling from this is that that's not what Braddon is saying, because, I mean, well, the colonel gets to live his life sad, and the woman dies. So, you know, it does indeed feel yikes. Yeah, exactly. In the modern words of a generation, it feels yikes. Sorry, that sounds like I'm taking the piss on that. I'm absolutely not. You're spot on. Thank you. Yeah, like, it's... Yeah. Sorry, I've just gone and derailed myself now. Yeah, like, it's... That thing, that attitude gets... It's there in a lot of literature. Usually stuff written by men, and there's no criticism of it, and guys just kind of go, I want this, and the woman relents and goes, yeah, okay, sure, whatever, okay, and then he gets everything he wants. And in this, he doesn't get what he wants, which I feel is good. He doesn't deserve what he wants, but also that comes at the cost of her dying. So, like, yeah, it's not quite the ending I would want, let's put it that way, but yeah, I guess that's where it leaves me. But yeah, how are you all doing? You good? Hope everyone's well. I'm now just sitting here listening to the rain, talking to a microphone. I guess the next stream will be on Wednesday, presumably. Lucy looking to be back with further adventures of the Count of Misty Christie. Oh, Belfast is a good film. Yes, I saw you say that in the break. Good. I am glad to hear it. Monte Cristoing, yeah. Monte Cronte. I'm just going to keep calling it silly things like that now, because it's been going on for so long that words lose all meaning. Mount Crispy, I believe, is what that stands for. And so, yeah, there will be more of that. Oh yeah, I will actually acknowledge, yes, you regret, yeah, good. I make people regret decisions. That's my power. Yeah, the VODs uploaded onto YouTube are going a bit slow again because, fun thing, when Twitch mutes a VOD or a section of a VOD, and you then upload that to YouTube, it doesn't upload the unmuted version. It uploads it with like a big chunk of just silence wherever that bit was. So what I'm having to do is to contest the claims on it, like file a dispute for each one, and then wait. Basically, what's meant to happen is you put in a dispute, and then it goes back to the people that made the dispute, and they look at it and go, oh yeah, that's actually not our music, it's just an automated system that's flagged it up. Apologies, and remove it. What happens is they don't. Because why would they? They don't have to. They've made the claim, and the onus is on no one, frankly. Just a rush. So yeah, basically we have to wait for those claims to expire before I can upload the unmuted VODs. It's a real pain, but I don't want to put up like stuff out of sequence. So yeah, I've got a bit of a backlog of Monte Cristo VODs to put up. And oh yeah, because there was also the Destiny lore reading, the Book of Sorrow stuff. That's got a big chunk of silenced bit on it as well. But that didn't actually seem to cut across any reading, so I figured, I'll just let that go. But yes, in theory what I'm trying to do is to upload unmuted stuff, and Twitch is making it difficult. So yes, that will resume once that is settled. And if it keeps on happening, then I'm probably just going to have to like download them and upload them myself, which takes a lot longer, but I guess in the long run, as a process, it's a lot longer, but as an overall process, it's going to get things up much faster. So yeah, I'll probably end up having to do that, but we shall see. But for now, yeah, I'm just sitting here running my mouth talking, and I have food to go and get to. So I think I'm probably going to draw things to a close, and I shan't be raiding over to anybody, but personally where I'm going to go is over to Loading Ready Run, because they are streaming, Adam and Ben are streaming Elden Ring, and that's very fun and enjoyable to watch. So I'm going to go over there and do that. You're welcome to join me if you like, but it's your own life. You're free to live it. So yeah, I'm going to go, and we will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and the people around you. Oh, you're welcome, Josh. Thank you for being here. And same to you, Thunder. And everyone else who has been around in chat. I'm not going to start calling people out. But yeah, thank you very much. It's lovely to have people that turn out and read this and listen to this. Oh yeah, thank you, Lynn. And I'm really glad to be able to provide a lovely evening for you, Thunder. It's good to hear. But yeah, I'm gonna go. So take care of yourselves, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.